The great hall of Station Nexus hummed with tension as representatives from 47 different alien species gathered for what would become one of the most important meetings in galactic history. The station itself was ancient. It's built thousands of years ago when the first species came together to form the Galactic Council. Its walls had witnessed countless debates, treaties, and decisions that shaped the fate of billions across the stars. Daniel Hayes stood at the human podium, feeling very small and very alone. He was 42 years old, with short brown hair that was starting to gray at the temples and dark eyes that had seen more than most people his age. 6 months ago, he had been a colonel in Earth's Defense Force. Now, he was humanity's voice in a room, full of aliens who seemed to hate everything. His species represented. The chamber was unlike anything found on Earth. It stretched upward for hundreds of feet, with each species occupying their own special area designed for their unique needs. The Vexter, who looked like living crystals, sat in pods filled with mineral-rich mist. The Phenomenals, beings made of gas and energy, floated in containment fields that glowed soft blue. The Rakashi cat-like creatures standing on 2 legs occupied platforms near the middle levels. Everywhere Daniel looked, he saw strange and wonderful forms of life, and right now, all of them were angry at humanity. Supreme Arbiter Velkosh commanded attention from his elevated position at the center of the hall. He was tall and thin, with skin that seemed translucent, showing the flow of some kind of luminous fluid beneath. His species, the Ancients, had been keeping peace in the galaxy for longer than humans had been building cities. When he spoke, his words came through a translator device that made his voice sound cold and precise. Humanity has failed the galaxy, Velkosh declared, and his words echoed through the massive chamber. When the call came for help, when the Xiphon Confederacy begged for assistance against Krell aggression, 3 species answered. 3 species sent their fleets to defend the innocent. But humanity, with all their advanced weapons and their large military, chose to hide. Daniel felt his jaw tighten, but he remained silent. He had been instructed by Earth's government to listen first, to understand the full scope of their accusations before responding. It was good advice, even though every word felt like a knife. Ambassador Sharvik of the Rakashi rose next, her sleek fur rippling with emotion. My people have fought beside the Xiphon. We have seen their cities burn. We have watched their children flee in terror. And where was humanity? Safe in their corner of space, protected by their borders, caring only for themselves. More voices joined in. The Chitternack, insect-like beings whose speech came out as rapid clicks and chirps, expressed their disappointment through their translators. The Harmonics, creatures who communicated through musical tones, hummed a melody that the translators rendered as disgust and shame. One after another, the species of the Galactic Council stood to condemn Earth's decision. Daniel listened to every word. He watched their gestures, studied their body language as much as his training allowed. These beings were not just angry, they were genuinely confused. They could not understand why humanity would refuse to help when they had the power to make a difference. The Outer Rim conflict had been raging for 2 years now. The Krell Empire, a militaristic society that valued strength above all else, had begun expanding into territory claimed by the Xiphon Confederacy. What started as border disputes had exploded into full war. Colonies had been invaded. Space stations had been destroyed. Millions had died in the fighting. And millions more had been displaced from their homes. 3 months ago, the Xiphon had formally requested military aid from the Galactic Council. It was their right under the mutual defense provisions that all member species had signed. The Rakashi had sent 2 battle groups. The Harmonics had provided support ships and medical vessels. Even the usually peaceful Vexstar had contributed resources and supplies. But when the request reached Earth, human government had voted to decline. Daniel remembered the debates in Earth's parliament. He had been called in as a military advisor, asked to give his assessment of the situation. He had reviewed all the intelligence reports, studied the battle maps, and analyzed the strategic positions. And then he had told them something that most of the politicians did not want to hear. This was not a simple case of good versus evil. This was complicated, messy, and dangerous, in ways that went beyond the immediate conflict. But try explaining that to a room full of angry aliens who saw only suffering and wanted someone to blame for not stopping. The Supreme Arbiter finally turned his attention directly to Daniel. Ambassador Hayes, humanity has been accused of cowardice. You have been accused of abandoning your responsibilities to the galactic community. You have been accused of caring only for your own safety, while others die. What do you have to say in your defense? The chamber fell silent. Every eye, lens, sensor, and sensory organ focused on the human standing alone at his podium. Daniel could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him like a physical force. This was the moment he had been preparing for since arriving at the station. Everything depended on what he said next. Daniel took a slow breath and stepped forward. His hands gripped the rail of the podium. He looked out at the assembled representatives with an expression that was calm but intense. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear. "Thank you, Supreme Arbiter, for allowing me to address the Council," Daniel began. "I want to acknowledge that humanity did indeed refuse to join the Outer Rim conflict. I understand your disappointment. I understand your frustration. And I understand that many of you believe we acted out of cowardice." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "But before you make your final judgment about my species, I ask that you consider something you may not have fully understood. You know humanity as the newcomers to galactic society. You know us as the species that joined the Council only 60 years ago. You know our technology, our ships, our military capabilities. But I wonder how many of you truly know our history." Daniel activated the holographic display built into his podium. The lights in the chamber dimmed automatically, and images began to appear in the air above the assembled delegates. They were images from Earth, but not the peaceful, unified Earth that most of them had seen in official broadcasts. These were different. "This is my world," Daniel said quietly, as the first image resolved into clarity. It showed a battlefield from Earth's First World War. Soldiers standing in muddy trenches, their faces hollow with exhaustion and fear. This is what humanity was before we reached for the stars. The images began to cycle faster. Explosions, burning cities, refugees fleeing with everything they owned on their backs, mushroom clouds rising over devastated landscapes, mass graves, ruined monuments, shattered lives captured in photographs that were over 100 years old, but still carried the power to shock. "We need to talk about what my species has done," Daniel said, his voice filling the silent chamber. "We need to talk about the lessons we learned. And we need to talk about why those lessons matter to your accusations here today." The delegates watched in growing silence as humanity's dark history played out before them. And Daniel Hayes prepared to tell them truths they had never considered about the species they had just called cowards. The holographic images continued to fill the chamber, and Daniel let them speak for a moment before adding his words to the pictures. The delegates were watching now with something other than anger. Some seemed curious. Others appeared uncomfortable. The Vexstar and their misty pods had gone completely still, which Daniel had learned meant they were paying very close attention. "My species spent most of the 20th century perfecting the art of killing each other," Daniel said, his voice steady but carrying an edge that made even the largest beings in the room listen carefully. "We developed weapons that could poison entire battlefields with gas. We created bombs that could level cities in seconds. We built machines designed for only one purpose: to end human life as efficiently as possible." The images showed soldiers wearing masks against chemical weapons. They showed the aftermath of aerial bombardments that had reduced neighborhoods to rubble. They showed tanks rolling through streets and planes dropping fire from the sky. Earth's wars had been brutal in ways that few species in the galaxy could truly understand. "We fought over territory," Daniel continued. "We fought over resources. We fought over ideas and philosophies. We fought over which invisible being we believed created the universe, and we were very, very good at fighting. By the middle of the 20th century, humanity had killed more of its own kind than most plagues or natural disasters ever had." A new image appeared, and several delegates made sounds of shock or distress. It was the mushroom cloud from the first atomic bomb ever used in war, rising over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Daniel let them absorb the sight before explaining. In 1945, my species split the atom and turned it into a weapon. We dropped 2 of these bombs on cities full of civilians. Hundreds of thousands died, many of them instantly, others slowly from radiation. And we did this not because we had to, but because we calculated it would end a war faster than the alternatives. The Supreme Arbiter leaned forward in his pod. Ambassador Hayes, I fail to see how your species' violent history excuses your current inaction. Many civilizations go through periods of internal conflict before achieving unity. Daniel nodded, acknowledging the point. You are right, Supreme Arbiter. Many species have civil wars or conflicts before joining the galactic community. But I ask you this, how many of those species came within minutes of completely destroying themselves? How many created weapons specifically designed to make their entire planet uninhabitable? The images changed again, showing massive missiles and underground silos, launch facilities spread across multiple continents, submarines carrying enough nuclear weapons to devastate entire regions. The Cold War era of Earth history appeared before them, when 2 human nations had pointed thousands of nuclear weapons at each other and waited to see who would launch first. For 40 years, humanity lived under the threat of total extinction, Daniel explained. We built enough weapons to destroy our world dozens of times over. We created plans for mutual, assured destruction. The idea that if one side attacked, both sides would die. And we came close to using them. Very close. There were moments when the only thing standing between humanity and extinction was the decision of a single person to not push a button. He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the chamber. But we didn't push that button. Somehow, despite all our anger and fear and hatred, we pulled back from the edge. We looked at what we had built and realized we were standing on the edge of an abyss that would swallow everything we were and everything we could ever be. The images shifted to show Earth in the early 21st century. Climate change, resource wars, nations fighting over water and food as the planet grew hotter. Daniel's voice grew quieter, but everyone could still hear him perfectly. We thought we had learned. We thought the threat of nuclear war had taught us to be careful, but we were wrong. We kept fighting, just in different ways. We poisoned our own atmosphere. We destroyed ecosystems that had existed for millions of years. We let billions suffer because we couldn't agree on how to share the resources we had. The final image of this sequence was one that made even the most alien beings in the room understand. It was a view of Earth from space, but not the blue and green planet that appeared in Council databases. This Earth was half covered in gray clouds, the aftermath of the nuclear exchange that humanity called simply the last war. We had our final war, Daniel said, and his voice carried the weight of memory even though he had been born years after the event. A regional conflict over water rights escalated. Nuclear weapons were used. Then more were used in response. Then more. In 1 week, 200 nuclear weapons were detonated across 6 continents. 4 billion people died. 4 billion. More than a third of our entire species gone in 7 days. The silence in the chamber was complete. Even species that did not share human emotions seemed affected by the stark numbers. And my grandmother was 8 years old when the bombs fell, Daniel continued, his voice softer now. She lived in a place called Colorado, in what used to be the United States. Her family made it to a bunker before the blast wave hit their city. They stayed underground for 3 months, breathing recycled air, eating preserved food, listening to the radiation counters click, and wondering if they would ever see the sun again. He looked up at the assembled delegates, and some of them seemed to flinch from the intensity in his eyes. She is still alive. My grandmother, who hid in a hole in the ground while her entire civilization burned, still lives on Earth. She is 93 years old, and she remembers everything. The screams, the fires, the silence that came after, when there was no one left to scream. She remembers what it smells like when a city burns. She remembers the taste of ash in recycled water, and she remembers the promise that humanity made when we finally crawled out of those bunkers. Daniel deactivated the historical images and brought up a new picture. It was a memorial, a massive wall of black stone with words carved in hundreds of languages. The English version was clearly visible to the translation systems. "This stands at the ruins of Geneva, where the old United Nations used to meet," Daniel said. "It says, never again will humanity bring war to the innocent. Never again will we sacrifice others for our ambitions. Never again will we assume violence is the answer." He let those words hang in the air for a long moment before continuing. "That is why humanity hesitated before joining your war, Supreme Arbiter. Not because we are cowards. Not because we don't care about suffering, but because we know in our bones and our blood and our history what it costs when species give in to violence too quickly. We know because we paid that price. We stood in the ashes of 4 billion dead and promised them we would be better." Ambassador Sharvik of the Rakashi stood again, her tail lashing with agitation. "Your history is tragic, Ambassador Hayes, but it does not change the present situation. The Ziffin are suffering now. They need help now. Should they pay for humanity's past mistakes?" Daniel turned to face her directly. "I would never ask the Xiphon to pay for our mistakes. But I also cannot ignore what my species has learned. And what we have learned is this: wars are rarely as simple as they appear. There is always more to the story than innocent victims and evil aggressors. There are always complications that people prefer not to discuss." The Supreme Arbiter's translucent form seemed to shimmer with irritation. "Are you suggesting the Ziffin deserve their fate? That the Krell invasion is somehow justified?" "No," Daniel said firmly. "I am suggesting that before humanity commits its military to any conflict, we ask questions. Hard questions. Uncomfortable questions. Questions like why this war started, who benefits from it continuing, and whether military intervention will actually help or just make things worse." He looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes and sensors as he could. Every species in this room has a history. Every species has made mistakes. But how many of you have looked into the face of your own extinction and somehow survived? How many of you carry the memories of billions of your own people dying because you were too quick to fight and too slow to think? The chamber remained silent, and Daniel knew he had their attention now. They might not agree with him. They might still think humanity was wrong. But at least they were listening, really listening, to what he had to say. "Before you judge humanity as cowards," Daniel concluded, "you need to understand that our caution was bought with the highest price any species can pay. And if that makes us slow to jump into your wars, then so be it. We will not apologize for refusing to repeat the mistakes that nearly destroyed us." The delegates in the chamber were no longer shouting. The anger that had filled the room when Daniel first stood to speak had transformed into something more complex. Some species seemed thoughtful, processing what they had heard. Others appeared defensive, as if Daniel's words had struck closer to home than they liked. The Supreme Arbiter sat motionless in his elevated pod, his luminous internal fluids moving in patterns that suggested deep concentration. Daniel knew this was the moment to press forward. He had shown them humanity's scars. Now he needed to help them understand why those scars mattered to the current situation. "I asked you a question earlier," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "I asked how many species in this chamber have fought wars of extinction against themselves. I did not hear any answers." He waited, giving them time to respond. No one spoke. "That is because the answer is none," Daniel continued. "Every species here has had conflicts. I have studied your histories, all of them. The Rakashi fought border wars with 3 neighboring species before achieving spaceflight. The Vextar had something you call the Crystal Wars, where different colonies battled for control of mineral-rich asteroids. The Harmonics had what you translated as the Discord, a period where different philosophical groups tried to suppress each other's songs. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably as Daniel listed their historical conflicts. He was not judging them. He was simply stating facts that everyone knew but rarely discussed in formal settings. But none of you turned your full power against yourselves, Daniel said. None of you built weapons designed specifically to destroy your own homeworld. None of you came so close to total self-destruction that only luck and the hesitation of a few individuals saved you. That experience, that unique and terrible experience, changes how a species thinks about war. The Supreme Arbiter finally spoke. Your point is understood, Ambassador Hayes. Humanity has suffered greatly from its own violence. But surely you can see the difference between internal conflicts and external aggression. The Krell Empire is invading Ziffin territory. This is not a civil war. This is conquest. Daniel nodded. You are right that it is not a civil war, but I wonder if it is truly as simple as conquest. Tell me, Supreme Arbiter, have you personally reviewed the complete diplomatic records of this conflict? Not the summaries. Not the briefings. The actual communications between the Krell and Ziffin over the past 10 years. The Arbiter's silence was telling. I have, Daniel said. My government assigned a team to review every available document before we made our decision. And what we found was not a simple story of evil aggressors and innocent victims. What we found was complex, messy, and very familiar to anyone who has studied Earth's history. He activated his display again, but this time instead of images, text appeared. Treaties, agreements, communications logs, all translated into the common galactic language. 15 years ago, the Krell and Ziffin signed the Outer Rim Accord, Daniel explained. It established borders and resource sharing in the disputed territories. Both sides agreed to it. Both sides ratified it through their governments. But then both sides began to violate it in small ways. The text scrolled, highlighting specific incidents. The Ziffin established mining operations in areas designated as neutral zones. The Krell began military exercises closer to Ziffin's space than the treaty allowed. Both sides filed complaints. Both sides ignored the other's complaints. The violations grew larger. The tensions increased. And neither side was willing to compromise because they both believed they were right. Ambassador Sharvik stood again, her fur bristling. Are you seriously suggesting that the Ziffin brought this war upon themselves? That is obscene. I have seen the refugee camps. I have spoken with survivors of Krell attacks. The suffering is real. Suffering is absolutely real, Daniel agreed, and his voice carried genuine sympathy. I do not doubt that for a second. War causes immense suffering, and the people caught in the middle of this conflict are true victims. But Ambassador Sharvik, I must ask you something directly. Do you remember the Ziffin expansion? The Rakashi ambassador went very still. Her tail stopped moving. When she spoke, her voice was cautious. That was 300 years ago. 312 years ago, to be exact, Daniel said. The Ziffin, flush with new propulsion technology, began expanding rapidly into nearby systems. One of those systems contained a Rakashi colony world. Rakash Prime, I believe it was called. The Ziffin blockaded it and demanded tribute in exchange for allowing trade ships through. Sharvik's ears flattened against her head. My people paid the tribute to avoid conflict. That incident was resolved peacefully, it was Daniel agreed. Because your people chose to give in rather than fight. But it was still aggression, was it not? The Ziffin used their military advantage to extract resources from a weaker species. They were not victims then. They were the aggressors. The chamber erupted in murmurs and discussions. Daniel had touched on something that made everyone uncomfortable. He was not criticizing the Rakashi for giving in or defending the Ziffin's past actions. He was simply pointing out that the clear lines between good and evil that everyone wanted to believe in were not nearly as clear as they seemed. This is the problem, Daniel said, raising his voice to be heard over the noise. Every species here wants to believe that wars have heroes and villains. You want to believe that one side is completely right and the other is completely wrong. But that is almost never true. It certainly was not true for most of Earth's wars, and from what I can see, it is not true for this one either. He brought up more documents. In the past 2 years, both the Krell and Ziffin have been offered ceasefires. Multiple times. The Harmonics proposed one 8 months ago. The Vexstar proposed another 5 months ago. Both times, both sides rejected the offers. Do you know why? No one answered, though Daniel suspected many of them did know. Because both sides think they can still win, Daniel said. The Krell believe they can force the Xiphon to surrender and gain control of the disputed territories. The Xiphon believe that with enough support from the Council, they can push the Krell back and reclaim everything they have lost. Neither side wants peace. They want victory. Supreme Arbiter's voice was sharp. So humanity's solution is to let them fight until they exhaust themselves. To stand aside while millions die? No, Daniel said firmly. Humanity's solution is to refuse to take sides in a conflict where both sides are wrong. Our solution is to refuse to legitimize a war that serves no purpose except pride and territory. Our solution is to ask hard questions that apparently no one else wants to ask. He looked directly at different sections of the chamber as he continued. Why has this war lasted 2 years when both sides have been offered reasonable peace terms? Why are both sides so confident they can win when the military situation has been stalemated for months? And most importantly, why does the Galactic Council want humanity to tip the scales? Daniel's voice grew harder. You did not ask us to help end the war. You did not ask us to mediate or negotiate or find a peaceful solution. You asked us to take the Xiphon's side. You asked us to add our military weight to one side of a conflict between two species who are both being stubborn and foolish. And when we said no, you called us cowards. The chamber was silent again. Daniel could see that his words were landing now, really landing. Some delegates looked angry. Others looked thoughtful. A few, he noticed, looked guilty. Let me ask all of you something, Daniel said, his voice quieter but no less intense. If humanity had said yes, if we had sent our fleet to the Outer Rim, what would have happened? The Krell would have been pushed back. The Xiphon would have reclaimed their territory. And then what? Would the Krell have accepted defeat and made peace? Or would they have sought new allies, built more weapons, and prepared for the next war? He let the question hang in the air. Adding more military force to a conflict does not solve the underlying problems. It just determines which side wins. And if the problems are not solved, the war simply pauses until one side or the other is ready to start again. Earth knows this because we lived through it. We fought wars, won them, and then watched as the same conflicts reignited years or decades later because we never addressed the real causes. Daniel took a breath before delivering his final point. Humanity was not asked to help end the Outer Rim War. We were asked to help one side win it. And we refuse to do that because we have learned that winning wars is easy. Building lasting peace is hard. And if this council is more interested in victory than peace, then you need to ask yourselves what you really stand for. The Supreme Arbiter stared at Daniel for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its certainty. You make valid points, Ambassador Hayes, but you have not offered an alternative. If military intervention is wrong and standing aside allows the suffering to continue, what would humanity have us do? Daniel smiled, but it was not a happy expression. I am glad you asked, Supreme Arbiter, because humanity does have an alternative to propose. But first, there is something else you need to know about this war. Something that I think will change how you see this entire situation. Daniel Hayes stood quietly for a moment, studying the faces and forms of the assembled delegates. He had learned to read alien body language over the past 6 months. And what he saw now was a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. They sensed he was about to reveal something important, something that would change the nature of this debate. I told you that humanity reviewed the diplomatic records of this conflict, Daniel said. But that was not all we reviewed. For the past 8 months, Earth has been conducting a separate investigation into the Outer Rim War. We have been tracking weapons, shipments, analyzing battle reports, following money trails through some very complicated financial networks. The Supreme Arbiter leaned forward slightly. What kind of investigation? The kind that asks where both sides are getting their weapons, Daniel replied. The Krell Empire and the Xiphon Confederacy are both advanced civilizations. But neither of them has the industrial capacity to sustain a war of this intensity for 2 years. The battles we have seen reports of involve weapons and technology that exceed what either species should be able to produce on their own. He activated his display again, and this time the images were different. They showed cargo manifests, shipping routes, and energy signatures from deep space scanners. Numbers and technical data filled the holographic space above the delegates. 8 months ago, one of our deep space monitoring stations detected unusual plasma signatures near the Outer Rim territories. The signatures matched advanced weapons that are not manufactured by either the Krell or Ziffin. Our intelligence services began tracking these signatures, and they found something interesting. The data began to organize itself into patterns, showing shipping routes that connected various points in space. Someone has been selling weapons to both sides, not just small arms or basic equipment, but advanced plasma charges, quantum disruption, torpedoes, and shielding technology that is significantly better than what either species had before the war started. Several delegates shifted nervously. The chamber's atmosphere had changed from defensive to something more anxious. We followed the money, Daniel continued, his voice steady and professional. We traced the shell corporations, the intermediary accounts, and the manufacturing sources. It took months of work, but our intelligence teams are very good at this kind of investigation. Earth spent a long time learning how to track weapons dealers and war profiteers. We had plenty of practice during our own wars. The holographic display shifted to show a network diagram, lines connecting different points labeled with species names and corporate identities. Daniel let the image speak for itself for several seconds before adding his commentary. The weapons being sold to the Krell are coming from manufacturing facilities in VE X-Star space. The components for Ziffin fighter craft are being produced in Rakashi industrial complexes. The advanced shielding technology that both sides are using comes from harmonic research stations that are supposed to be dedicated to peaceful scientific work.
Ow.
The chamber exploded. Delegates from the accused species stood and began shouting denials. Others demanded to see proof. The Supreme Arbiter had to activate the harmonic suppression field just to restore enough order for people to hear each other speak. These are serious accusations. Ambassador Hayes, the Arbiter said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. I hope you have evidence to support them. I do, Daniel said calmly. He began displaying documents, hundreds of them. Scrolling through the holographic space faster than most beings could read, but slow enough for the translation systems to capture everything. We have shipping manifests showing Vexstar cargo vessels making unauthorized stops in neutral space. We have financial records showing payments from Krell-aligned corporations to Rakashi industrial firms. We have communications intercepts where harmonic scientists discuss their shield research being adapted for military applications. Evidence continued to mount. Purchase orders. Payment transfers. Even video footage from remote monitoring stations showing cargo transfers between ships that were supposed to have no connection to the war. Daniel had brought everything, and he laid it out methodically, piece by piece, building a case that was impossible to deny. But it gets worse, Daniel said, and his voice carried an edge now that made even the largest beings in the room pay attention. Because we did not just find evidence of weapons sales, we found evidence that certain parties have been actively working to prolong this war. New documents appeared. Diplomatic communications that had been leaked at critical moments, poisoning peace negotiations before they could succeed. Intelligence reports shared with both sides, at times calculated to increase paranoia and mistrust. Even suggestions whispered through back channels that victory was possible if only one side or the other would commit just a bit more. Someone has been playing both sides, Daniel said. Someone has been making sure that every time peace seemed possible, something happened to restart the fighting. And that someone has been making enormous profits from selling weapons to both the Krell and the Ziffin. Ambassador Sharvik had gone completely still, her fur flat against her body in a posture that Daniel had learned indicated shame or distress. Other delegates were frantically accessing their own data systems, checking Daniel's evidence against their own records. The Supreme Arbiter sat in his pod with his internal fluids moving in rapid, agitated patterns. This is why humanity refused to join your war, Daniel said, and his voice had gone cold. Not because we are cowards. Not because we do not care about the suffering of the Ziffin or any other species, but because we recognized exactly what this was. We have seen this pattern before in our own history. War profiteering, manipulation, species willing to let others die if it means filling their own treasuries. He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes and sensors of delegates who had been so quick to condemn Earth just an hour ago. You asked humanity to take sides in a conflict that you yourselves were helping to perpetuate. You asked us to add our military weight to a war that serves no purpose except to enrich weapons, manufacturers, and corporations. You asked us to legitimize bloodshed that could have been stopped months ago if the people profiting from it had not been sabotaging every peace effort. Daniel's voice rose slightly. Not in anger, but in something fiercer. And when we said no, when we refused to be part of your profitable little war, you called us cowards. You condemned us for not caring about the innocent. You questioned our commitment to the galactic community, all while you were selling the bombs that were killing those innocents. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Some delegates had disconnected entirely, their holographic forms disappearing as they fled the session. Others sat frozen, unable or unwilling to respond to the accusations Daniel had laid out. Ambassador Sharvik finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I did not know. I swear by the stars, I did not know about the weapons. Daniel's expression softened slightly. I believe you, Ambassador. I do not think most of you knew the full extent of what was happening. But your governments knew. Your military contractors knew, and they sent you here to shame humanity into joining a war that was making them rich. The Supreme Arbiter had regained some of his composure, though his voice was strained. What proof do you have that governments were involved? These could be rogue corporations acting without official sanction. That is possible, Daniel acknowledged. And I truly hope that is the case. Because if your governments were officially involved, then this council has a much bigger problem than one refused military commitment. But either way, the weapons came from council member territories. The profits went to council member accounts. And the result was thousands of deaths that could have been prevented. Deactivated the display and stood facing the assembly with nothing between them but empty air and the weight of truth. Humanity learned a long time ago what happens when people profit from war. We learned what it looks like when corporations care more about quarterly earnings than human lives. We learned how easy it is to convince yourself that you are helping when really you are just making things worse. And we swore on the graves of 4 billion dead, that we would never be those people again. Daniel's voice dropped to something quieter, but no less powerful. So when this council asked us to join your war, we investigated first. We asked questions. We looked beneath the surface. And we found exactly what we were afraid we would find. A conflict being prolonged for profit, dressed up in the language of justice and defense. He spread his hands in a gesture that somehow conveyed both frustration and determination. That is why we said no. Not because we are cowards, but because we refuse to be accomplices to this. We refuse to add our strength to a war that serves no one except the people selling weapons. We refuse to pretend that adding more violence will somehow lead to peace. The chaos in the chamber continued for several minutes. Delegates argued with each other, demanded explanations from their own governments, and tried to process the implications of what Daniel had revealed. Some species were clearly shocked by the evidence. Others seemed less surprised, perhaps having suspected something was wrong but lacking proof. The Supreme Arbiter made several attempts to restore order, but the normal rules of diplomatic procedure had broken down under the weight of the accusations. Daniel waited. He had said what needed to be said. He had shown them the truth. Now they needed time to absorb it, to understand what it meant for them and for the council itself. He stood quietly at his podium, hands relaxed at his sides, watching the greatest diplomatic institution in the galaxy tear itself apart over the revelations he had brought. Finally, the Supreme Arbiter managed to activate the suppression field long enough to make himself heard. This session is temporarily suspended. All delegates will return to their quarters while we investigate these claims. Ambassador Hayes, you will make all your evidence available to the Council's investigative committee. Of course, Daniel said, Earth has no interest in hiding anything. We want the truth to be known. The Arbiter's luminous form pulsed with what might have been frustration or embarrassment. Before we adjourn, I must ask you directly. If these accusations are proven true, what does humanity expect from this council? What is your purpose in revealing this information? Daniel took a moment to consider his answer. This was perhaps the most important question he would face today. His response would determine whether Earth remained part of the galactic community or became isolated by species who resented having their corruption exposed. "Our purpose is not to shame the Council," Daniel said carefully. "Our purpose is to offer a better way forward. But that requires honesty about what has gone wrong. You cannot fix a problem if you pretend it does not exist." He gestured to the empty space where his holographic evidence had been displayed. "The Outer Rim War can end, not through military intervention that would only prolong the suffering, but through genuine diplomatic pressure applied equally to both sides. If this council stops the weapons flow, if you cut off the corporations profiting from the conflict, both the Krell and Ziffin will be forced to negotiate. They are not ancient enemies locked in eternal struggle. They are nations that got into a fight that spiraled out of control, encouraged every step of the way by people who had financial interests in keeping them angry at each other." The chamber was quiet now, listening. Daniel pressed his advantage. "Earth is prepared to host peace talks on neutral ground. We will provide mediators who have no stake in the outcome. We will guarantee the safety of both delegations. And we will work with any council members willing to act in good faith to build a sustainable peace. Not just a temporary ceasefire that will collapse as soon as it is convenient." Ambassador Sharvik, who had been sitting in humiliated silence, raised her head. "Why would humanity do this? Why offer to help after we accused you so harshly?" Daniel met her gaze with sympathy. "Because my species understands what it is like to be caught in cycles of violence. It seems impossible to break. We know what it feels like to want peace, but not know how to achieve it. And we know that the only way to stop these cycles is for someone to step forward and offer a genuine alternative to war." He looked around the chamber, addressing everyone present. "But this requires a choice from all of you. You can continue as you have been, playing political games while people die in the darkness of space. You can protect your corporations and maintain your profitable status quo. Or you can remember why this council was formed in the first place. To prevent conflicts. To build cooperation. To prove that different species can work together for something better than mutual destruction." The Supreme Arbiter was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had lost the contempt it had carried at the beginning of the session. "And if we refuse? If we decide that Earth has overstepped its authority by investigating council members without permission?" Daniel had expected this question. It was the natural response of any institution caught doing something wrong. To attack the messenger, rather than address the message. He kept his voice calm and factual. "Then humanity will release all of this evidence publicly. Every species in known space will see what we have found. The corporations will be exposed. The council members involved will have to answer to their own populations. And the carefully maintained image of the Galactic Council as a force for peace will be destroyed." Several delegates made sounds of protest, but Daniel held up his hand. "Earth has no desire to destroy this institution. We believe in what the Council is supposed to represent, but we will not be silent while corruption hides behind diplomatic immunity. If the Council will not police itself, then the citizens of the galaxy deserve to know what is being done in their name." It was a threat, and everyone knew it, but it was also an offer. Reform or be exposed. Choose integrity or face consequences. Daniel had given them both stick and carrot, and now they had to decide which they valued more. However, Daniel continued, his voice softening slightly. "I truly hope it does not come to that. I hope that this council will see this as an opportunity to become what it claims to be, an institution dedicated to peace, a gathering of species committed to solving problems without violence, a force for good in a galaxy that desperately needs good forces." The Supreme Arbiter's internal fluids had slowed their agitated movement. He appeared to be genuinely considering Daniel's words, rather than simply trying to defend the council's reputation. When he spoke, there was a note of something that might have been respect in his translated voice. "You've given us much to consider. Ambassador Hayes, this session is officially suspended for 3 days while we investigate your evidence and determine our response. The Council will reconvene to discuss our findings and decide on a path forward." Daniel nodded. "Thank you, Supreme Arbiter. Earth stands ready to assist in any way that serves the cause of peace. As the delegates began to disconnect and leave the chamber, Ambassador Sharvik approached Daniel's podium. Her movements were slow and her posture showed shame, but she met his eyes directly. "I apologize," she said simply. "I called your species cowards. I was wrong." Daniel offered a slight smile. "You were working with incomplete information. We all were. That is why investigation and questions are so important. Assumptions can be deadly." "Will your people truly help mediate peace?" Sharvik asked. "Even after how we treated you?" "Yes," Daniel said without hesitation. "Because holding grudges and seeking revenge are exactly the behaviors that perpetuate cycles of violence. Humanity learned that lesson the hard way. We are not going to waste that education." The Rakashi ambassador bowed her head in a gesture of respect and departed. Daniel stood alone in the emptying chamber, feeling the weight of what he had done settling onto his shoulders. He had potentially made enemies of some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. He had exposed corruption that would have far-reaching consequences. And he had committed Earth to a peace process that might take years to succeed, if it succeeded at all. But it was the right thing to do. His grandmother would understand that, even if no one else did. 3 days later, the Galactic Council reconvened. The Supreme Arbiter announced that an independent investigation had confirmed the majority of Earth's evidence. Several council members had been found to have connections to the weapons, manufacturers supplying both sides of the Outer Rim War. Sanctions were being imposed. Reforms were being drafted. And most importantly, a complete weapons embargo was being placed on the conflict zone, effective immediately. Furthermore, the Council officially requested that Earth serve as neutral mediator for peace talks between the Krell Empire and the Zifin Confederacy. Both sides had been informed that continued fighting would result in their suspension from Council trade privileges. The message was clear: negotiate or face. Isolation.Neil stood at his podium and accepted the responsibility on behalf of humanity. He thanked the Council for their willingness to reform and their commitment to genuine peace. And he privately acknowledged that this was just the beginning of what would be a long and difficult process. 6 weeks later, representatives from both the Krell and Zifin arrived at Earth's Orbital Peace Conference facility. They were angry, suspicious, and convinced that the other side would never negotiate in good faith. Daniel met them both with patience, understanding that their anger came from real pain and loss. The talks began slowly. There were accusations, denials, and several times when one side or the other threatened to leave. But Daniel and his team of human mediators kept bringing them back to the table. They listened to grievances. They helped both sides see that their enemy was not some inhuman monster, but people who were also scared, hurt, and desperate for security. It took 3 months to achieve a preliminary ceasefire. Both sides agreed to pull their forces back from the most contested territories and allow neutral observers to monitor the borders. It was not peace, not yet, but it was a start. The shooting stopped. The dying paused. And in that silence, something new became possible. Daniel returned to Earth after the ceasefire was signed. He walked through the memorial gardens at the ruins of Geneva, reading the names of the dead from the last war. 4 billion names carved in stone. A reminder of what happened when species chose violence over dialogue. His grandmother was waiting for him at his apartment in New Colorado. She was 93 now, frail in body but sharp in mind. When he told her what he had done at the council, how he had stood before the galaxy's most powerful beings and refused to let humanity be shamed for choosing peace, she had simply nodded. "Good," she said. "We did not survive the fire just to light new ones." That night, Daniel began writing his report for Earth's government. He described the council session, the evidence he had presented, and the peace process that had begun. But he also wrote something more personal, a reflection on what humanity's role in the galaxy should be. Other species might have better technology, he wrote. They might have longer histories or more powerful militaries. But humanity had something unique. They had looked into the abyss of their own extinction and somehow found the strength to pull back. They had learned lessons that could not be taught, only experienced. And those lessons gave them a perspective that the galaxy needed. Even if the galaxy did not always want to hear it, being called cowards by those who had never faced what humanity had faced was a small price to pay if it meant fewer species would have to walk through the fire that Earth had walked through. If humanity's stubborn insistence on questioning wars, on demanding evidence, on refusing simple answers to complex problems could save even one civilization from the path Earth had taken, then every insult was worth bearing. The galaxy was vast and would always contain conflicts. But if humanity could be the voice that asked the hard questions, that insisted on exhausting peaceful options before resorting to violence, that remembered the cost of war when others had the luxury of forgetting, then perhaps their terrible history would serve a purpose after all. Daniel finished his report, sent it to Earth's parliament. Then he looked out his window at the stars and thought about the Krell and Ziffin, negotiators still working through their differences on the orbital station. Peace was hard. Peace was slow. Peace required patience and compromise, and the willingness to see your enemy as something other than evil. But it was possible. Humanity had proven that by unifying after their last war, and now they would help others prove it too. One difficult conversation at a time. Not as cowards, but as people who understood that true courage was not the willingness to fight, but the strength to choose peace when war seemed easier. The stars looked back at him, infinite and patient. And Daniel Hayes allowed himself to hope that humanity's dark past might light a better future for the galaxy.